The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above Mercy General's trauma bay as Ashley Cooper moved between stations with the kind of efficiency that looked effortless to the untrained eye. 3 years. That's how long she'd been invisible here, pushing a supply cart through hallways that smelled of antiseptic and resignation, eating lunch alone in her car, volunteering for the graveyard shifts that nobody else wanted. The hospital had become her monastery, a place where she could heal others without anyone asking questions about the scars on her own hands, the ones that came from holding tourniquets in sand instead of saline in sterile rooms. Her scrubs were the same navy blue as everyone else's, nondescript and forgettable, which was exactly the point. She'd chosen this life deliberately, carved it out like a fox going to ground, because after Marjah and everything that came after, invisibility felt like mercy. 3 years of floor placements and bed pans and charting had become her cover story, and she'd memorized it so completely that sometimes she almost believed it herself. Just a nurse. Adequate. Unremarkable. The kind of person you'd forget 5 minutes after she left the room. But her hands remembered different work. At 6:48 a.m., during shift change, Ashley moved through the supply closet with practiced precision, every item placed exactly where it belonged, no wasted motion, no hesitation. The ventilator tubing. The central line kits. The suction catheters. Her muscle memory had learned this rhythm in field hospitals under mortar fire, and 3 years of civilian work hadn't made her forget. Her fingers moved like they were on autopilot, and that was the dangerous part. That was the part that might give her away if anyone was paying attention. When she organized, she didn't look like she was thinking. She looked like she was remembering. Before her shift officially started, Ashley approached her locker, one of 30 identical grey boxes in the staff area, and opened it with the kind of quiet that comes from practice. The unit patch was folded at the bottom, beneath her spare scrubs and the protein bar she never ate. Faded. Worn at the edges. The patch from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Helmand Province, Marjah, the place where 17 lives came home because her hands didn't hesitate when hesitation meant death. Her son wore the same patch in the photos he sent her, the one she kept encrypted on her phone and looked at only after midnight when the crying wouldn't wake him through the walls. Her fingers touched the fabric for exactly 3 seconds, no more, no less, and then she closed the locker and her jaw tightened imperceptibly, the kind of micro-expression that only another warrior would recognize. The corridor outside stretched in both directions, fluorescent and white and endless. She walked it like she'd walked every corridor in this hospital for the past 1,095 days, head down, shoulders neutral, present but not remarkable. Just another nurse moving through the morning shift. The badge clipped to her pocket caught the light and made no sound against the starched fabric. Her shoes, practical black clogs, regulation standard, made the faint squeaking sound of rubber on sealed linoleum. At 7:15 a.m., during morning rounds, Dr. Sterling made the announcement that would change everything. He stood in the center of the nurses' station like a man accustomed to being the most important thing in any room, his white coat pressed to surgical precision, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a symbol of his dominion. Sterling had the kind of face that belonged in a private country club, sharp angles, careful grooming, the type of arrogance that comes from generational money and boarding school. He'd been at Mercy General for 7 years, and in that time he'd built a hierarchy as rigid as military command structure, except without the honor codes that military hierarchy demanded. He was the attending. Everyone else was beneath him. This was not a suspicion for Sterling. This was law. A priority admission, he said, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone who expected immediate attention. VIP case. Marine general en route from Germany, critical injury sustained in a vehicle-borne IED attack 3 days ago. Transferred through Ramstein, arriving ETA 8:45 a.m. I want the best trauma assessment on this unit. I'm personally taking primary. The nurses nodded. The residents took notes. Ashley stood at the far end of the counter and felt something shift in her chest, a seismic movement of plate tectonics that made her breathing change for exactly 2 seconds before she controlled it. A Marine general. An IED. Transferred from Germany. She raised her hand quietly, not waiting to be called on because waiting was a civility she'd learned to perform. "I'd like to volunteer for the case," she said. Her voice was soft, deferential, the voice of someone who knew her place in the hierarchy and was content there. "I have experience with trauma admission protocols." Sterling's eyes moved to her with the kind of lazy appraisal a man might give a piece of furniture he'd never really considered. "Experience," he repeated, as if testing the word. 3 years of nursing experience." "Yes, I'm aware. You can assist. But this is my case." "Clear." "Clear, doctor," she said. What Sterling saw was an adequate nurse with unremarkable credentials offering to do the work nobody wanted to fight over. What he didn't see was the way her hands didn't tremble, not even slightly, at the announcement of trauma incoming. What he didn't see was the calculation happening behind her eyes, the mental checklist she was running through like a combat veteran preparing for contact. What he didn't see was the way her breathing had synchronized with the ventilator sounds in the distance, a kind of autonomic readiness that came from having lived through scenarios that would break most people. She excused herself at 8:10 a.m. and went to the trauma bay to prepare, moving with the kind of efficiency that looked like routine but was actually the compressed muscle memory of a senior chief petty officer who had done this 1,000 times in conditions that would make a civilian hospital look like a luxury resort. She checked the trauma code equipment. The crash cart. The defibrillator pads, the proper placement. Her fingers moved across each item with surgical precision, confirming location and function by touch alone. 14-gauge angiocath needles, sized and ready. Rapid infuser hanging. 2 units of O-negative blood pre-positioned. The kind of setup that came from experience, the kind that made the difference between a patient who walked out with stories and a patient who didn't walk out at all. By 8:43 a.m., the unit was ready, and Ashley was standing in position near the intake station when the ambulance doors burst open and the stretcher rolled in with the kind of controlled urgency that only professional transport teams managed. The general was unconscious, his face wrapped partially in bandages, his left arm immobilized, his breathing supported by a transport ventilator that wheezed its mechanical rhythm through the trauma bay. The paramedic called out vitals in staccato bursts, BP 10/68, dropping, heart rate 118, respiration 16/vent, conscious level GCS of 5, estimated blood loss 1,200 milliliters, 2 large bore 4s established en route, type O positive running wide open. Dr. Sterling moved immediately to the head of the stretcher, his hands already reaching, his presence demanding the room reorganize around his authority. Ashley saw it happen in her peripheral vision, the residents stepping back, the nurses deferring, the established hierarchy asserting itself like a predator establishing dominance. Sterling's voice was sharp and commanding, asking questions rapid fire, already building his narrative of the case before he'd even completed his assessment. But Ashley's eyes had locked on the jacket that the general wore beneath the trauma blanket. She could see it partially, could see the stitching along the inside of the collar where something had been sewn carefully into the lining. The lining. That was where unit patches went when soldiers wanted to carry home with them but couldn't display the weight of it openly. That was where memories went when they were too heavy to wear on the outside. Her breath caught for exactly 1 second, and she forced it back to normal, forced her expression to remain neutral, forced her hands to stay steady as she moved to her assigned position at the patient's right side. The patch was there. Faded. Worn. The same one from Marjah. The same unit. The same place where she'd held her hand steady while everything around her came apart. The same place where this general had led her son's unit, had sent those Marines into situations that came back with fewer people than they'd started with, but came back alive because a senior chief petty officer made decisions in the dark that saved lives. Sterling was talking, barking orders, establishing himself as the essential element in this room, but Ashley's attention had narrowed to a kind of laser focus that civilian life had taught her to hide. She began her assessment with movements that looked like routine nursing care, checking line placement, confirming monitor leads, documenting initial observations, but every action was informed by 12 years of military medical training, by field experience that had taught her how to read injury patterns the way other people read facial expressions. The bandaging on the left arm. The pattern of trauma across the torso. The way the patient was breathing even through the ventilator, unconscious but still fighting. This was someone who'd survived combat before. Dr. Sterling glanced at her once, noted her competence, and something flickered across his face, a micro-expression of calculation that Ashley recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room suddenly encountering someone whose hands moved with a precision that didn't match her official credentials. It was the expression of someone beginning to suspect that the hierarchy he'd constructed might have a flaw in it, a person who knew too much about trauma codes for someone with only 3 years of nursing experience. He watched her work. She felt him watching. And in that moment, something that had been carefully hidden began to crack, just slightly, just enough that if someone was looking closely, and Sterling was always looking closely, they might begin to wonder who this quiet nurse really was. The monitors beeped. The ventilator wheezed. The trauma bay settled into organized chaos around them, and Ashley Cooper, adequate nurse with unremarkable credentials, moved through it all with the kind of steady grace that came from having already survived the worst things the world could do. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling was already calculating how to contain her. Sterling was already calculating how to contain her, and he moved with the precision of a man who'd spent 15 years weaponizing hospital hierarchy. He'd made 3 phone calls before Ashley finished her shift that night, calls to board members who owed him favors, calls to administrators who understood that competence without credentials was a threat to the entire structure. By morning, the machinery was in motion. The general's wife and adult daughter arrived at 7:30 a.m. for rounds, bringing flowers that wilted slightly in the overheated hospital corridor. They stood flanking the bed as Sterling entered, his white coat starched enough to crack at the edges, his presence moving through the room like a tank idling in a garage. Ashley followed 2 steps behind, her charts organized, her observations precise, her eyes carefully neutral. Sterling reviewed the overnight notes with theatrical slowness, turning pages with the deliberation of a prosecutor building a case. He glanced at Ashley's handwriting, her careful documentation of the general's pain levels, her clinical notes about medication responses. Then he turned to the family, his voice pitched to carry down the hallway. Nurse Cooper's documentation here is adequate, I suppose. Though I notice she's made suggestions about pain management protocols that are, shall we say, above her pay grade. She means well. He smiled, the kind of smile that made people uncomfortable without understanding why. But nurses sometimes forget that 3 years at a community hospital doesn't quite match my 15 years of critical care experience. The daughter shifted. The wife's jaw tightened. Ashley felt every eye in the room settle on her like weight. She took one measured breath. The fluorescent light overhead hummed its mechanical song, and in that hum, she heard the ventilators from Marjah, the monitor alarms from forward operating bases where she'd kept men alive with nothing but training and nerve. One tear threatened her left eye. She didn't blink it back. She wiped it, a single motion, deliberate, and maintained eye contact with Sterling without apology. I've seen enough men suffer, Ashley said quietly. I won't apologize for ending it when I can. The room went so quiet you could hear the 4 drip, 3 drops per second, mechanical and relentless. Sterling's face flushed from his collar upward, a crimson tide that told her she'd violated something sacred, the unspoken rule that subordinates don't speak back. Not like that. Not with that kind of authority underneath the softness. That's exactly the cowboy attitude that concerns me, Nurse Cooper. Or should I call you Florence Nightingale? His voice had an edge now, the edge of a man whose control was being questioned. Because that's what this is. Reckless fantasy, not medicine. The daughter looked uncomfortable. The wife studied Sterling with new calculation. Ashley said nothing else. There was nothing else to say. She'd already told him the truth, and the truth was the most dangerous thing she could offer. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 2 days later. The break room at Mercy General was a small fluorescent space with a microwave that smelled perpetually of fish and regret. On Tuesday at noon, Ashley sat at the communal table with her homemade sandwich, turkey, mustard, no mayo, and her water bottle. She'd been working through lunch for 3 years. Today she decided to eat with the other nurses. Within 30 seconds, 3 of them exchanged glances. Not words. Glances. They stood simultaneously, grabbed their food, and relocated to the hallway. A fourth, Janet, who'd worked nights with Ashley for 18 months, mouthed sorry before following them out. The room emptied. Ashley sat alone at a table meant for 10. Her hands were steady around the water bottle. Her eyes fixed on the muted television mounted in the corner, some daytime program playing to an audience of 1. She ate half the sandwich before her appetite disappeared entirely. She wrapped it back in plastic, threw it away, and washed her hands for exactly 90 seconds. The soap smelled like cheap flowers and surrender. This was stage 2 of Sterling's campaign. This was the part where isolation became weapon and silence became reinforcement. He'd made the calls. He'd planted the story, probably something about how Ashley was difficult, how she'd overstepped, how it was best to keep professional distance until the situation resolved. The hospital was a small ecosystem. The toxin spread fast. By Wednesday, the write-up appeared on the unit board beside the nurse's station, where every staff member passed it multiple times per shift. Sterling had tacked it up at 2 p.m. during shift change, when maximum visibility was guaranteed. The notice was printed on hospital letterhead, clinical and official. Nurse A. Cooper, written warning. Failure to follow chain of command protocol regarding medication administration. Unauthorized communication with patient family regarding treatment plans. Further violations will result in termination. Ashley saw it from the supply room doorway. She watched Sterling position himself at the nurse's station, waiting until she emerged. He turned when he heard her footsteps, smiled the smile of a man holding cards he believed were unbeatable. Just keeping standards high, Cooper. Nothing personal. Ashley's knuckles whitened around the clipboard she was holding. The metal edge bit into her palm. She said nothing. The silence between them stretched like something alive, something that fed on words unspoken. Around them, nurses pretended not to notice. Patients in the hallway beyond the unit doors noticed everything. That night, she sat alone in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before driving home. The rain had started, not heavy, just steady, the kind that came to Houston in late summer and stayed for days. It drummed on the roof with the rhythm of a field hospital during mortar fire, and she sat with her hands on the steering wheel, just sitting, just breathing. The general's condition began changing on Thursday at 11 p.m. Ashley was monitoring telemetry from the nurse's station when she noticed the ST segment shifting on the monitor, subtle changes, the kind a nurse with 3 years of experience might miss, the kind a senior chief petty officer who'd worked in field hospitals under fire would recognize instantly as disaster preparing to arrive. She paged Sterling. He appeared 15 minutes later, his shirt untucked on one side, his eyes saying clearly that he'd been doing something more important than responding to a page about a stable patient. He glanced at the monitor from the doorway. His vitals are stable, Cooper. Stop wasting my time with paranoid nursing intuition. His CVP is rising, blood pressure dropping. He's developing. I can read a monitor. Sterling's voice had dropped into the dangerous register. Go check on your other patients. It wasn't a request. It was a command framed as a dismissal. Ashley hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, and that was all the opening Sterling needed. That's an order, Florence. She went. She checked on the patients in rooms 412, 413, and 415. She charted their vitals, adjusted their 4 rates, answered a call light from a post-op colectomy who needed ice chips. But her attention stayed on the general's monitor, visible from the nurse's station, the green line tracing his heartbeat like a prophecy she'd already read. At 1:30 a.m., the bottom fell out. The pressure readings crashed. The heart rate became erratic, climbing to 128, then 134, then beyond the monitor's visible scale. Ashley ran to his room and found him unresponsive, his skin pale and beginning to mottle, his jugular veins distended like they might burst through his neck, the sounds of his heartbeat muffled beneath his ribs like something drowning inside his own chest. Beck's triad. Classic presentation. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid compressing his heart, pressure building inside the pericardium, time becoming currency with only minutes left in the account. She hit the code button. The overnight team was 3 floors up, managing a massive stroke. The ER was slammed with a highway accident, and Sterling was unreachable, his cell going to voicemail, his home phone ringing into empty rooms. The general had minutes. Maybe less. Ashley stared at the crash cart. She stared at her hands. She stared at the bed and the man inside it, unconscious and dying, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical effort of a system beginning to collapse. The monitor alarm screamed, a sound that carved itself into the hospital's emergency architecture like a voice demanding response. She thought of Marjah. She thought of the forward operating base at Sanjan Valley, where she'd performed emergency procedures under fire with equipment that was barely adequate, where she'd held lives together with her hands and her training and her refusal to accept that someone should die because they didn't have the luxury of waiting for a doctor. She thought of her son, somewhere in the Middle East right now, serving under this man's command. She pulled open the crash cart and removed the pericardiocentesis kit, the needle, the catheter, the syringe. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of training that lived deeper than conscious thought. She didn't think about authorization. She didn't think about protocol. She thought about the 17 Marines this man had brought home alive because he'd made smart decisions under pressure, and she made her own smart decision now. The needle went in at the 5th intercostal space, below the xiphoid process, at the precise angle that would avoid the lungs and pierce the pericardium. The hiss of air escaping told her she was in the right place. She drew back on the syringe and pulled out blood, 300 milliliters of it, dark and thick, the reason the general's heart was drowning. The monitor rhythm changed. The oxygen saturation climbed. 72. 80. 88. Stable. But that wasn't the moment that changed everything. That came when she looked up and saw Dr. Sterling standing in the doorway, his face white, his expression cycling through disbelief and calculation and rage. The general's monitors began singing a different song at 11 p.m. Not the steady rhythm of recovery. The telemetry screen flickered with ST segment changes, subtle, almost apologetic, like the first tremor before an earthquake. Ashley noticed it immediately. The way his oxygen saturation drifted down. 68%. 66. The blood pressure beginning its slow descent like a closing fist. She knew this pattern. She had seen it 3 times in a field hospital in Helmand Province, and twice it had cost lives. She reached for the phone and paged Sterling. Code 5. Urgent callback requested. She waited 7 minutes. Then 12. The general's restlessness increased, a sign his body knew something was wrong even if his conscious mind didn't. The slight panic in his breathing. His hands gripping the sheet. Ashley adjusted his oxygen to 15 liters and waited. At 22 minutes, Sterling finally called back. "What is it?" His voice carried the tone of a man interrupted mid-sleep, irritated at the intrusion. The general showing acute changes. ST elevation, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation declining. Ashley kept her voice level, clinical. Data. No emotion. No pleading. Just facts. His post-op. He's supposed to feel like shit. Check the morphine drip. Already confirmed. The issue isn't pain management, Dr. Sterling. His vital signs are deteriorating. He needs evaluation now. A pause. The kind of pause that precedes a decision made from ego rather than evidence. I'll be there in a few minutes. Don't touch anything until I arrive. 18 minutes later, Sterling appeared in the doorway, still buttoning his white coat over scrubs that smelled like they'd been retrieved from a laundry basket. His hair was mussed. His expression was the careful mask of someone who resented being right about needing to come in but would find a way to blame the messenger for the inconvenience. "Walk me through it," he said, not looking at the patient, looking at Ashley like she was a subordinate filing an inaccurate inventory report. Blood pressure dropped from 118 to 87 in 40 minutes. Oxygen saturation went from 97 to 64. The monitor's showing classic signs of, "I can read the monitor, Ms. Cooper." His eyes finally moved to the telemetry screen. He squinted at it the way someone squints at a menu written in a language they don't quite speak. Probably just post-operative edema. His heart's been through trauma. It needs time. The general's head turned. His eyes were losing focus. That was what frightened Ashley most, not the numbers on the screen, but the way consciousness was beginning to slip, the way his body was shutting down in self-defense. She had felt this same sensation in herself once, after a roadside IED near Sanjan Valley. The body's knowledge before the mind catches up. "His heart rate is 142, Ashley said. She kept her voice steady, the way she'd been taught to keep it steady under fire. "He's in distress." Sterling leaned closer to the monitor, frowning. For a moment, just a moment, she thought it might register. Might trigger the pattern recognition that separates good doctors from dangerous ones. Then he straightened up. "We'll observe him. These things take time. If it doesn't improve in an hour, we'll get cardiology down here. I'm going back to sleep. Call me if there's actual change, not if you're just nervous." He left. The door hissed shut behind him with the sound of finality. The general's blood pressure dropped to 79/51 inside 7 minutes. Ashley moved without hesitation. Not because she was panicked. Not because she was desperate. She moved because her body remembered something her conscious mind had tried to bury for 3 years. She moved the way soldiers move when IDF is incoming, with purpose, with economy, with absolute certainty about what came next. She grabbed the ultrasound machine. Her fingers found the probe with the kind of muscle memory that survives time and bureaucracy and trauma that never quite heals. She positioned it over the general's chest, right of the sternum, and the image crystallized on the screen. Dark. Fluid. Lots of it. A pericardial effusion the size of a fist compressing the heart into something that could barely squeeze blood through the system. Cardiac tamponade. The heart being suffocated from the outside. "I need you to stay still for 30 seconds, she said to the general, whose eyes were now half closed, consciousness drifting like a ship with a cut anchor. She didn't wait for Sterling. She didn't page the attending. She didn't fill out forms in triplicate or request authorization or ask permission from anyone wearing a tie or a title. She simply prepared his chest with antiseptic solution, the smell of it sharp as copper and alcohol, and found the needle. A 20-gauge angiocath. The right size for what needed to happen. Her hands moved with the precision of a pianist playing a piece memorized 15 years ago. Below the xiphoid process. Angling toward the left shoulder. Advancing slowly, watching the ultrasound screen, feeling the resistance of tissue giving way. The needle entered the pericardial space. The syringe filled immediately. Blood-tinged fluid. 60 milliliters in the first draw. The pressure in his chest beginning to release like air escaping from a punctured tire, that hissing sound of relief that meant the suffocation was ending. She withdrew the needle, disposed of it in the sharps container with a kind of precise movement that made it clear this was not the first time she had done this. Not in a sterile OR with a full team. Not with permission. In a field hospital in Marjah with mortars in the distance and 17 Marines depending on her hands not to shake. They hadn't shaken then. They didn't shake now. The general's oxygen saturation began climbing. 64%. 70. 82. His blood pressure crept upward like color returning to a face. His eyes fluttered open. He coughed, a good sign, consciousness returning, the death hold of the fluid released. The door burst open. Sterling stood in the doorway, still buttoning his coat, having apparently decided to come back, to prove something, to demonstrate that his return was tactical and not the result of equipment he'd forgotten to check. His face moved through a sequence of expressions so rapid they blurred together. Shock. Disbelief. Rage. Calculation. He saw the empty syringe. The fluid in the discard basin. Ashley's gloved hands. The general beginning to breathe like someone learning how to breathe again. What the hell did you just do? His voice had the quality of someone watching their authority dissolve in real time. Ashley calmly disposed of her gloves in the biohazard container. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. The voice that came out of her mouth was not the voice of a nurse who had been humiliated in front of the patient's family. Not the voice of someone who had been written up and isolated and told that her competence was merely adequate. This voice came from somewhere deeper. Somewhere that had spent 3 years being careful about volume and compliance. Emergency pericardiocentesis, she said. Cardiac tamponade. He had approximately 3 minutes before cardiac arrest. The general coughed again, his eyes tracking both of them. Confusion mixing with relief. Consciousness fully returning now. Understanding that whatever had been killing him was no longer killing him. Sterling's phone was already in his hand. You performed an invasive procedure without authorization. Without an attending physician present. Do you understand the liability exposure you just created? The protocol violations? He stepped into the hallway. His voice carried back through the open door like a funeral bell ringing across still water. I need to speak with Dr. Raymond. Yes. Now. I have a situation. A nurse? No, the nurse from the disciplinary write-up. She just performed an unauthorized pericardiocentesis. No authorization. No documentation. No cardiothoracic backup. Yes, I witnessed it. I'm going to need external investigation. Yes, the external investigator, her nursing school. I need verification of her credentials. There are gaps in her background. Significant gaps. This fits a pattern. Reckless. Cowboy medicine. Ashley stripped off her protective equipment. She typed careful notes into the medical record. The vital signs. The ultrasound findings. The procedure. The patient response. Each word precise, documented, the kind of documentation that either protected you or damned you depending on which side of power you happened to occupy. By dawn, Sterling had made 6 phone calls. To 3 board members. To the nursing school registrar where Ashley had completed her prerequisite coursework 10 years ago. To a hospital attorney. To someone in HR. Each call constructed the same narrative, the dangerous nurse. Reckless. Incompetent. A liability. A safety risk. A woman who thought she was smarter than protocols, who thought saving a life excused violating the chain of command, who had gaps in her background that suggested something hidden, something dangerous. By 6 a.m., the calls had reached people who made decisions. By 8 a.m., Sterling had documented her medical decisions as reckless. By 10 a.m., the external investigator had opened a file. The general's vital signs remained stable. His recovery progressed as recovery should. His gratitude to Ashley would have been visible in his eyes if she had stayed long enough to see it. But she wouldn't. Not yet. Not until everything Sterling had built collapsed completely. The administrative floor was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. 7 a.m. Ashley had been called in before her shift, summoned by text at 6:51 a.m. while she was still in her car. She knew what this was. She'd known since 2 a.m. when Sterling watched her hands drain fluid from a dying man's chest, watched her save a life while he stood frozen in the doorway. The chief nursing officer sat behind a mahogany desk. HR director to her left. Both avoided eye contact as Ashley entered. A termination letter lay centered on the desk, already signed, already processed. The words blurred: insubordination. Unauthorized medical intervention. Gross negligence. Pattern of misconduct. Ashley didn't sit. She stood with her hands loose at her sides, the way a sailor stands at ease. Her voice was steady, flat like still water. The general is alive because I acted. The CNO finally looked up. Her eyes were the color of worn stone. That's not for you to decide. You're a nurse, not a physician. Dr. Sterling documented everything. The external investigator agrees. This constitutes a termination event. The external investigator wasn't in the ICU at 2 in the morning. No. The HR director slid the letter across the desk. And he doesn't need to be. Your employment with Mercy General ends effective immediately. Security will escort you to your locker. You have 15 minutes to collect personal items. Your badge is deactivated as of now. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Sterling had done in the hours before dawn. While Ashley was still standing over the general, cardiac monitor singing its steady rhythm beneath her fingers, Sterling was on the phone. 3 calls. 3 board members who owed him favors from surgical partnerships, from speaking engagements, from years of careful networking. The first call came at 3 a.m. I need this situation contained before administration arrives. The second came at 3:24. By 4:15, Sterling had contacted her nursing school references, colleagues from Houston Methodist and Ben Taub, people who'd known Ashley years ago. He'd planted seeds. Doubts. Questions about her credentials, her decision-making, her fitness for patient care. By 5 a.m., an external investigator had already been briefed, the consultant Sterling had worked with before, a man whose reports always aligned with the narrative Sterling constructed. The pericardiocentesis, which in any other context would be heroic, had been reframed as reckless cowboy medicine. Unauthorized invasive procedure. A violation of chain of command. A nurse operating outside her scope, putting a patient at risk, compromising hospital protocols and physician authority. Sterling had built his whole career on control. On hierarchy. On the understanding that nurses were tools, not thinkers. And Ashley had, in one moment in the dark, broken every assumption he'd constructed. So he'd burned her to the ground before she could burn him. Security was waiting outside the office when Ashley emerged. A young man in a Navy uniform, apologetic and professional. He walked with her down the corridor she'd crossed every morning for 3 years. Past the break room where the coffee was always terrible. Past the supply closet where she'd restocked for lines at midnight. Past the unit board where her disciplinary write-up still hung, laminated and permanent. Her locker was small. A jacket. A pair of backup shoes. A framed photo of her son in his marine dress blues from boot camp graduation, already deployed to Helmand Province before she'd even landed this nursing job. She reached into the locker's corner, behind the shoes, where the faded unit patch hung. She'd sewn it into her jacket lining 3 years ago, a talisman against the weight of memory. Marjah. October 2010. 17 Marines she'd held together in a forward operating base while insurgent fire shredded the aid station. 17 lives she'd kept breathing until medevac came. She unpinned the patch from the jacket. Slipped it into her pocket. Surrendered her badge to the security officer. The badge clattered against the plastic counter like a closing door. By 10 a.m. she was walking to her car in civilian clothes, jeans, a grey t-shirt, sneakers. She'd changed in the locker room, watched by no one because no one was permitted to look at her anymore. The parking lot was the same one she'd crossed 3,000 times. Rain hung in the Houston humidity like a threat. She didn't turn on the radio. Didn't call anyone. Just drove home in silence, hand steady on the wheel, jaw locked against the weight of words she couldn't say. At 3 p.m., her son came home from school. He found her at the kitchen table. Still in the clothes she'd worn out of the hospital. No lunch made. No grocery bags unpacked. Just Ashley sitting at the table like a statue, staring at nothing. "Mom? Why are you home?" She tried to speak. The words were there, somewhere deep where the senior chief lived. But they wouldn't come. Couldn't come. Because the truth was a grenade with the pin already pulled. Her son was 17. Deployed with 1st Marine Division. Same unit where the general had commanded him. Same unit where Ashley had spent 3 years keeping his commanding officer breathing in the dark, pulling fluid from around his heart with her hands moving on their own, muscle memory taking over when the world went code blue. He sat down across from her. Confusion spreading across his face like infection. "Mom, what happened?" "I saved someone." Her voice was barely audible. A whisper from a deeper place. "Someone important to you. And they fired me for it." "Who?" She couldn't tell him. Couldn't explain that the general who'd written letters of recommendation for his deployment, who'd briefed his platoon before insertion, who'd commanded his unit from a forward operating base 30 miles from Marjah, she couldn't tell him that man was alive because she'd remembered everything she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. I can't explain it right now." Her son reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm, calloused from rifle training. She realized, looking at his face, that he was afraid. Terrified. His mother, who'd been so steady, so certain, was breaking in front of him and he had no idea why. She cried then. The kind of crying that comes from a place too deep for words. 3 years of silence shattered. All the weight of the senior chief she'd hidden, the trauma medic who'd kept 17 Marines alive on a prayer and improvised equipment, the decorated officer who'd walked away from everything because staying would have destroyed her, all of it came apart at a kitchen table in Houston while rain hammered the windows like applause. Her son held her hand and didn't let go. The rain stopped at noon. 2 days of silence, 2 days of her son asking questions she couldn't answer, 2 days of staring at her phone waiting for a call that never came. Ashley had returned to the porch where she'd sat after her termination, watching the Houston street like it held answers. The oak trees dripped their final drops onto the asphalt below, and she thought about how water always finds a way through, eventually. About how hidden things always surface. The sound came first. Not a siren. Worse. The distinctive thud of military boots hitting pavement in formation. 4 of them, maybe 5. Ashley's entire body went rigid. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. She knew that rhythm. She'd walked in that formation for 17 years. A Marine convoy had pulled up to Mercy General's entrance. Not a civilian car. Not a hospital administrator. A Humvee with military insignia and 4 officers in dress blues climbing out like they'd come to collect a debt that had been outstanding for years. Their dress uniforms meant this wasn't a social call. The medals on their chests meant they'd come because something mattered enough to leave their desks. Ashley was inside the lobby before she consciously decided to move. Her son stood near the reception desk, eyes wide as saucers, watching for Marines in dress uniforms stride toward the administrative offices. The lead officer, a colonel with the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years making other people's decisions for them, moved with the kind of purpose that made the air pressure change around him. "We're looking for Senior Chief Ashley Cooper," the colonel said. Not a request. A command. His voice carried the weight of institutions that didn't negotiate. The lobby went dead silent. Her son turned. Saw her. His mouth opened. "Mom." Then his eyes found the Marines. Then her face. The pieces were assembling in real time, and she could watch him realizing that the woman who'd cooked his dinner and picked him up from school and whispered lullabies when he was sick was someone else entirely. "You're a senior chief." Ashley didn't answer. She stepped forward. The Marine snapped to attention, not rigid, but present. Waiting. The colonel's eyes met hers and something shifted in his face. Recognition. The kind that comes from looking at someone you thought was gone. "Senior Chief Cooper," he said quietly. "I'm Colonel James Halstead, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. I served under your command in Marjah." The room tilted slightly. Ashley steadied herself by not moving at all. The colonel opened a file folder with hands that trembled, actually trembled, and began reading. Bronze Star for Valor under fire in Sanjan Valley, 2009. He paused. Swallowed. 2nd Bronze Star for coordination of casualty evacuation during Operation Moshtarak, 2010. Another pause. The lobby had filled with nurses and administrators and people who'd shunned her in break rooms. They were listening now. Purple Heart for wounds sustained while treating incoming patients under mortar fire, same operation. Ashley's son reached for her hand. She let him. And a Navy Cross, the colonel continued, his voice dropping so low the nurses had to lean forward to hear. For actions in Marjah that resulted in the successful stabilization and evacuation of 17 Marines, including a general officer, under conditions that should have been impossible to survive. 17 men came home because of you, Senior Chief. 17 families had mothers and fathers and sons at their dinner tables because you refused to let casualties be casualties. A Navy SEAL team leader stepped forward, tattoos like a roadmap of deployments covering his arms, eyes the color of winter water. I was one of those 17, he said. His voice was gravel and respect. You saved my life in that field hospital. You wrapped a tourniquet I thought was the end and told me I was going to make it home. You made me believe you. He turned to the colonel. She kept a photo of all of us. Last one taken before things fell apart. She looked at that photo every day for a decade. The image hit Ashley like a fist. She'd kept that photo hidden in a book. Her son had never seen it. The FBI agent stepped forward, the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from federal credentials and unlimited authority. Dr. Marcus Sterling attempted to falsify your personnel records to justify your termination. His keystroke log shows 3 separate instances where he accessed the hospital's secure file system, edited your employment history, and sent emails impersonating hospital administration. The agent's jaw was tight. Federal investigators have every keystroke. Every phone call he made to board members using false information about your credentials. Everything. That was when the commotion started. Security was moving through the administrative floor. A man in a white coat, Dr. Sterling, was being led out in handcuffs by federal agents. The nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room watched him pass. Some looked away. Some didn't. His perp walk played out on the hospital's security monitors. Real time. His career ending in real time. The other doctors stepped back as he was escorted past. The handcuffs caught the fluorescent light like a final exclamation point. The general himself arrived on the porch at sunset, still weak from surgery, still moving like his body hadn't yet forgiven him for nearly dying. He was discharged against medical advice, something that should have been impossible, but when you're a general and a Marine, sometimes the rules rearrange themselves around you. He took the porch steps slowly, one hand on the railing, and found Ashley sitting with her son watching the street. The general looked at her for a moment. Just looked. Then he dropped to one knee. Tears streamed down his face like rain on stone. You saved me twice, Senior Chief. Once in Marjah when you stabilized my Marines under fire. Once 2 days ago when you refused to let protocol kill me. You know the cost of that? Do you know what you gave up? Ashley helped him to his feet. He was lighter than he should have been, fragile in a way that generals weren't supposed to be. The cost was worth it, she said quietly. The general touched the patch inside his jacket, the faded unit insignia, worn thin from 17 years of him keeping it close. I kept this because I needed to remember. Needed to remember that the senior chief who ran that aid station was the bravest person I ever served with. I needed to remember that courage looks like a calm voice and steady hands, not a uniform or a rank. He turned to her son. Your mother is why I came home from Afghanistan. She's why 17 of us came home. 1 week later, Sterling stood before a federal judge in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and the dry recycled air of institutional justice. He pleaded guilty to avoid trial. His medical license was suspended. His career, the thing he'd built his entire identity around, was finished. The news showed him 6 months later, teaching CPR basics at a community college. Demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy named Annie to students who didn't know they were learning from a man who'd once been chief of critical care at one of Houston's largest hospitals. His voice was flat. His movements were mechanical. The students didn't look up from their phones. Meanwhile, Mercy General held a public ceremony. The hospital's CEO presented Ashley with the institution's highest civilian honor while her son stood beside her in his Marine dress uniform, home on leave. The same board that had fired her formally apologized and offered reinstatement with back pay. She declined. She'd accepted a position with the VA, training trauma nurses and helping veterans transition to civilian medical careers. During her acceptance speech, asked about her years away, she spoke quietly into the microphone. "I wasn't hiding from who I was. I was learning to live with what I'd seen. Sometimes healing looks like running away. Sometimes it looks like showing up quietly every day until you remember who you are." She looked at her son. "And sometimes it looks like saving one more life because that's what you trained your whole career to do." The general, fully recovered, clasped her hand beside her. "Senior Chief Cooper taught me that rank is temporary but character is permanent. She taught me that again when she risked everything to do what was right." The video ended with Ashley walking out of Mercy General with her son, the same doors she'd been escorted through in disgrace now opened by Marines in dress uniform. The closing text read, "Dr. Sterling teaches CPR at Houston Community College. Senior Chief Ashley Cooper trains the next generation of combat medics at the VA. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." What you just witnessed is proof that the truth has a way of surfacing. That institutions built on lies eventually collapse. That the quietest person in the room might be carrying the weight of 17 saved lives. If this story moved you, if you found yourself cheering for someone you'd underestimated, please like this video. Subscribe. Comment below with your own story of being underestimated, because I promise you, there's someone in your life who's hiding their strength in plain sight. Thank you for watching.